The Holloway family lived on a quiet street in Crescent Ridge. George Holloway, a well-respected tech mogul, had built his multi-million-dollar company from the ground up. A man of discipline, strategy, and ruthless ambition, George had the kind of life most could only dream of. His wife, Linda, a once energetic nurse, had given up her career to raise their children, Emma and Ethan. Emma, a high-achieving teenager who excelled at everything, was the golden child, and Ethan, well, he was the problem. A rebellious, wild 17-year-old with no direction, Ethan had become a source of constant stress for the family. But outwardly, the Holloways seemed perfect. Behind closed doors, the cracks began to show. George was obsessed with his public image, and the pressure to maintain his reputation slowly ate away at his marriage. Linda had grown distant, tired of playing the role of the perfect wife, while George threw himself into his business empire. He rarely spent time at home, instead attending endless meetings, working late into the night, and texting his assistant Sophie at all hours of the day. Linda noticed, and her suspicions grew. Their marriage was a facade, one that no longer held any real love or passion. Ethan's behavior had spiraled out of control. He'd been skipping school for weeks, hanging out with a rough crowd, and his temper was worse than ever. Linda tried to intervene, but George, too busy with his company, dismissed it as a phase. Ethan felt abandoned by both his parents. His anger toward them was building. The seeds of resentment had been planted. In late October, everything came to a head. Linda was found dead in her kitchen, brutally murdered. The scene was chaotic. The door to the house was ajar, and Linda's body was sprawled across the kitchen counter. Her head was battered beyond recognition, and a pot of boiling water had spilled next to her. The house showed signs of forced entry, but no valuables had been taken. It didn't look like a robbery gone wrong, but complete violence. George was the one who discovered Linda's body, calling the police in a panic. His voice trembled as he explained that he'd been on a business trip when Emma had called him. She had found Linda dead, and George rushed home to find his wife's lifeless body. But the police quickly grew suspicious of George's demeanor. He seemed distraught but oddly composed, as if rehearsed. There was something off about his reaction. Detective Holly Ross, a seasoned investigator with a sharp eye, was assigned to the case, and from the start she sensed George wasn't telling the whole truth. Emma, still in shock, couldn't offer much useful information. She had been at a friend's house when her father called. When she arrived home, her mother was already dead, and George was in a state of confusion. He didn't seem to know what had happened. But Emma couldn't help but notice the strange way George was acting, like he was trying too hard to seem upset. It wasn't right. Ethan, who had been at a party that night, seemed completely unaffected by his mother's death. He didn't hear about it until the police contacted him, and his alibi was shaky. Friends and family gave conflicting accounts of where he'd been and who he'd been with. The more Ross dug into Ethan's whereabouts, the more questions arose. Ethan's strange indifference, his lack of grief, made him a prime suspect in Ross's eyes. Ross, unwilling to overlook anything, focused her attention on George. She dug into his life, unearthing a web of deceit and lies. What she found was chilling. Sophie, George's assistant, had been more than just an employee. She had been having an affair with George for months. Sophie was in her early 20s, ambitious and attractive. Everything George's wife wasn't anymore. The texts between them revealed a relationship that had gone far beyond business meetings. Their conversations were intimate, flirtatious, and increasingly frequent. George, obsessed with maintaining his business empire and status, was using Sophie as an escape, a distraction from his failing marriage. Ross uncovered a slew of incriminating evidence, but Sophie initially denied involvement in Linda's death. She insisted that she and George had been working late at the office when Linda was killed. However, surveillance footage from the office told a different story. Sophie wasn't there. Under pressure, Sophie cracked. She admitted to the affair but swore she had no part in Linda's murder. Still, Ross wasn't buying it. Sophie might not have killed Linda, but she knew something. There was no way she could be innocent. Digging deeper into George's finances, Ross uncovered even darker secrets. George had been hiding millions of dollars in debt from shady investors, money laundering schemes, and illegal transactions that threatened to collapse his entire business. His obsession with maintaining a perfect family and a perfect image had cost him everything. The facade was crumbling, And Linda's murder seemed to be the catalyst that triggered everything to fall apart. Ross then turned her attention to Ethan. The troubled teenager had been increasingly distant, and as Ross sifted through his texts, she found something alarming. Ethan had known about his father's affair. After Linda's death, the Holloway family hosted a neighborhood potluck, an event that was supposed to be about healing and supporting one another. But as guests mingled and ate, something was off. The pot roast, in particular, seemed to be a big hit. It was rich, tender, and perfectly seasoned. Almost too perfect. George and Sophie were the ones serving the food, acting unusually cheerful for a family who had just lost their wife and mother. It wasn't until weeks later that a local chef who had attended the potluck called the police. He couldn't shake the strange taste he'd experienced while eating the meat. It was familiar, almost unsettlingly so. His instincts told him something wasn't right. The police sent the leftover food for forensic analysis, and the results were horrific. Human tissue had been found in the pot roast. The town was rocked by the revelation. George and Sophie had murdered Linda, dismembered her body, cooked her, and served her remains to their friends, coworkers, and neighbors as a sick joke. They had used the potluck as a cover-up, knowing no one would suspect them of the unthinkable. As Ross pieced the story together, she discovered more disturbing truths. Ethan wasn't just a bystander. He had been complicit in the murder. But the motive wasn't what anyone had initially believed. Ethan hadn't been driven by money or revenge. He had been consumed by hatred for his mother. He felt abandoned by both of his parents, and Linda's constant attempts to intervene in his life had pushed him to the brink. In his mind, her death had been a form of liberation, a way to free himself from her control. Even more chilling was the fact that George had been planning Linda's death for months. He had been poisoning her slowly, feeding her small doses of toxins that had caused her health to deteriorate over time. Her death had been a carefully orchestrated move, part of George's plan to keep his business afloat, conceal his affair, and cover up his illegal financial dealings. In the end, the Holloway family's dark secrets were exposed for all to see. George, Sophie, and Ethan were arrested and charged with murder, desecration of a corpse, and conspiracy. The town of Crescent Ridge was forever changed. The perfect family, once revered by all, had been nothing more than a house of lies and betrayal. Emma, the only surviving member of the family, was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. Her dreams for the future crushed by the unthinkable horrors that had unfolded in her own home. The Holloway name would forever be synonymous with tragedy, and the residents of Crescent Ridge would never forget the chilling tale of betrayal, murder, and the horrific events that had unfolded right under their noses. Man, this story is just mind-blowing, right? The twists, the lies, the way everything seemed perfect on the outside until it all came crashing down. It's insane. It's hard to even imagine how deep this web of deceit went, and to think it all happened under the nose of a quiet suburban neighborhood. If you're still processing this, trust me, I am too. Let me know what you think in the comments, because I can barely wrap my head around how messed up this one was. The names, the details, and the sentences of this case are not real. These made-up scenarios allow us to explore suspenseful situations without exploiting real-life tragedies. Our goal is to create thought-provoking mysteries while respecting the privacy and dignity of real people. Thank you for watching, and let us know your thoughts below.